In the 1930s, the Stalinist regimes of the Soviet Union, in an attempt to encourage industrialization, used the modern-day territory of Ukraine as a breadbasket and stole the food supply from the people, resulting in the death of millions. In China in 1958, the Maoist government funneled all of the country's resources to the government to encourage industrialization. However, all this really caused was famine for the common people, and what became one of the greatest catastrophes in what was a 20th century that was full of them. In both cases, atrocities were covered up by their oppressive governments. Another famine discussed historically is the famine that took place in Ireland from 1844 to 1851. This famine also resulted in the deaths of millions and the diaspora of almost 25% of the Irish population all over the globe. 1.8 million out of a population of 8.4 million at the time. Similar to the famines in Ukraine and China, the government rejected culpability, Britain's government in this case, and suggested other causes for the famine. In the video to follow, I will examine the following question based on available research. Was the Irish Potato Famine, or Great Hunger as it's called by some, engineered by the British government, like the Great Leap Forward or Holodomor in Ukraine? Or were the British more or less innocent, victims primarily to vicious rumors of Irish accusations and an extremely virulent fungus? Let's take a look at what the research says. Without getting into too much detail, I want to give a little bit of background on what exactly the Irish Potato Famine was. As a colony of Britain, Ireland was part of the most powerful empire on earth near its height. In the early 1840s, though, Ireland underwent a catastrophic event that changed the entire history of the country. As a result of a potato famine, many Irish people either died on the island or left it entirely. Of the island's 8 million inhabitants, 700,000 immigrants left Ireland from 1845 to 1849, with over 2 million Irishmen leaving over the course of the 1800s. In addition, while estimates vary, it is reported that up to 1 million Irishmen died over the course of the famine from 1844 to 1852. The population prior to the famine topped 8.4 million and should have increased to 9.1 million people, according to the Census Commission. In reality, the Irish population by the end of the famine was 6.5 million, a decrease of almost 2 million people. Over 20% of the population was gone from Ireland just over the space of 8 years. For a basis of comparison per capita, this is on par with both 20th century famines in China during the Great Leap Forward and Ukraine, the famine known as Holodomor. Ukraine's Holodomor had death rates of around 13%, if the numbers are accurate. The Great Leap Forward was responsible for at least 20 million deaths. Some sources claim 45 million, which is around 5% of the population, if we accept death tolls of around 30 million. With the Irish Potato Famine, the death rate was around 1 million of an 8.4 million person population, equaling around 12%. This death rate stacks up quite evenly with the two previously referenced 20th century famines, making it all the more important to figure out exactly how culpable the government was. To start with, let's take the position of a defense attorney for the British government. When we group the British government with the Soviet or Maoist regimes, one might see that as unfair. Unlike in the case of the Great Leap Forward or Holodomor, the purported cause of the Irish Potato Famine, or the Great Hunger as it is sometimes called, a fungal blight, was a very real factor in causing a shortage of food. Herb 1, or Phytophthora infestans, if that's how it's said, originated in the Americas, most likely in Mexico's Toluca Valley, and spread to Europe at some point in the 1840s. This strain of fungus, not previously exposed to potatoes grown in Ireland, wreaked havoc on the potato crop. The Irish were over-reliant on potatoes in their diet. This fungus alone would have caused a famine, regardless of what the government in charge did. This would be a key argument in defending the British government from blame. As Donnelly, a writer for BBC, claimed in 2011, the Irish Potato Famine was not an artificial famine as the traditional Irish nationalist interpretation has long maintained, not at any rate at the start. The original gross deficiency of food was real. Also, to differentiate between Victorian England and Soviet Russia and China, the English did recognize that a famine was happening in Ireland. In fact, the English imported more grain into Ireland than they exported out of the country, not a trend one would have seen for most English colonies during the 17 and 1800s. On a policy front, the British government did try to assist the Irish in a multitude of ways. The British repealed a series of long-standing laws that had governed British trading, known as the Corn Laws. These laws were a series of heavy restrictions on foreign grain and corn coming into the country. These laws were part of a protectionist policy to protect British agriculture. However, they made foreign grain quite expensive. Lifting these restrictions allowed a greater importation of corn and wheat into famine-affected areas. Hard to blame the government when they're taking actions to alleviate the crisis. On a more personal level, Queen Victoria herself gave £2,000 to combat the famine. Other British elites also made charitable contributions up to £2,000 to help provide food and services to the Irish. No one made contributions greater than £2,000. We'll get to that later. The government also set up soup kitchens for the indigent for several months during the worst part of the famine in 1847. Numerous work programs were set up as well to keep the Irish employed during the famine. Although the government may not have always made decisions that ultimately worked for the Irish, they did try to assist, which certainly casts doubt into one's mind as to whether we can truly call this famine artificially manufactured by the British government. Even in today's world, economic philosophies and the effects of government policies on the public can be unclear. So one might even argue that whether the government was using interventionist policy or laissez-faire economics, it is difficult to assess how culpable the government really is during a famine like this, unless their actions are the only factor in causing the famine. As a defense attorney for the government, who is to say that the government, having acted differently, could have averted or even lessened the Irish nightmare that was the potato famine? With all that said, we still know that the famine did indeed occur. And regardless of the government's intent, we do know that the event was a total catastrophe for Ireland and its people. The tragedy is that if the government had acted differently, it might not have had to be as bad as it was. Now we look at the other side of the case, as a prosecutor against Britain, putting a government that might be termed negligent or even downright malevolent on trial for their actions. Before we get into statistics, we can talk very briefly about the psychology of the British government toward their colony next door. While some British citizens reacted by contributing in a charitable fashion toward the Irish during the potato famine, many British citizens also seemed to attack the Irish as the direct cause of their own misfortunes. Whether it be from Jonathan Swift's satire on cannibalism as an ironic response to the famine, or the report by British leader Charles Trevelyan, some British responses were at best insensitive, and at worst stood in the way of any real action being taken to alleviate the famine. Trevelyan's description is so bereft of sympathy, it really is worth examining. In his book, The Irish Crisis, published in 1848, Trevelyan described the famine as a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, one which laid bare the deep and inveterate root of social evil. The famine, he declared, was the sharp but effectual remedy by which the cure is likely to be effected. God grant that the generation to which this great opportunity has been offered may rightly perform its part. If you need a translation, basically, God's cutting the Irish people down for how they act. Trevelyan was a man who was in charge of the government, so it is not much of a stretch to assume that his attitude would percolate down to the public. Many British people, in the private and public sector, believed that the famine was primarily the fault of the Irish and a result of divine intervention against their moral turpitude. This attitude justified inaction toward assistance that the Irish desperately needed, putting at least some of the blame on the British government for the conditions of the famine. The Irish underwent an unfortunate change in political fortune right in the middle of the famine. When the Blight began to affect Ireland in 1845, Robert Peel, who was the Prime Minister at the time, adopted policies that would alleviate the issues for the Irish. This included the repeals of the Corn Laws and the importation of mass amounts of grain into Ireland. Peel seemed to be genuinely compassionate towards the lower class people of the empire, passing acts that limited hours on overworked people of lower social status. While this didn't work for reasons I will describe later, these acts still demonstrate at least some level of care for the needs of the Irish. However, in 1846, Peel left office and was replaced by a conservative politician named John Russell. Russell's views toward the Irish were more in line with the majority of British culture. The potato famine was divine intervention, and the Irish needed to solve the issue for themselves. Even before Russell took charge, though, there were some issues with Peel's policies, which might again be forgiven, for at least they were attempts to help improve the situation. The Irish potato, as discussed before, provided the majority of caloric intake for workers. As the potato was in severe shortage, Peel allowed for the importation of wheat and corn into Ireland to make up for the shortfall. Unfortunately, the imports of corn and wheat were far more difficult to work with than the potato. Additionally, Ireland lacked the infrastructure, the mills, to fully make use of the grain that was coming into the country. All the while, Peel continued to export potatoes out of Ireland into England, further exacerbating the shortage of potatoes. If Peel's policies were the only pieces of evidence, this might all be forgiven. After all, these policies at least demonstrate some care and compassion for the Irish, and were implemented with good intentions. From 1847 onward, though, the British adopted some policies that were actually counterproductive to solving the problems of the famine, and in fact may have amplified them. To begin with, the amount of corn and wheat imported decreased, and the infrastructure to use what was coming in was never improved upon. Food continued to leave an already starving island, and not enough came to replace it. Next, the Russell government callously raised taxes in 1847 to raise revenue from people, further complicating the situation for people who were already very poor financially. The Russell government chose a more conservative approach toward dealing with starvation. It, within a few months, converted soup kitchens into work programs where only the Irish, who worked on public works projects, received government assistance. The services provided were so meager that they didn't make up for the back-breaking physical labor being completed, as Irish workers were expending more calories than they were taking in. Instead of being provided government services, indigent Irish families were forced into these positions, a fate that even further demoralized the already dispossessed. These indigent families also could not leave Ireland either, as suggestions from others for the British government to pay for their immigration were shot down. Apparently, their only choice was to starve where they were. Russell alone is not to be blamed for the lack of resources coming into Ireland. The Queen, who donated £2,000 to combat the famine, never visited the island during the worst of the famine, and only arrived at the very end in 1852. As if not visiting was bad enough, there was also a rule that no charitable contribution could exceed her own. This act of ego preservation limited the resources provided in a very real way. The Turkish Sultan at the time offered to give £10,000 to assist the Irish in the famine, but obviously could not do so at the risk of angering a very powerful monarch. Statistics are often worth more than words, and one can look at mortality rates in Ireland as a good marker of whether or not the government's actions lessened the effect of the famine, or in fact, amplified the effect of the famine. This chart shows mortality rates during the famine as a percentage of the Irish population of 1841, according to the British Census Commission. Note the uptick in mortality in 1847 when the Russell government chose to implement the aforementioned policies through 1850. While it is hard to say for certain that the government might have taken other actions that could have totally prevented or mitigated the famine, most who look at these numbers would agree that they likely could not have done much worse. Given different policies, it is possible that these numbers could have been reduced significantly. Even to blame the Irish themselves, as the British did, might be construed to be the fault of the British government. Dagger John Hughes, the famous Irish preacher living in America, explained this to his parishioners during the years of the potato famine. Hughes explains that the lack of social mobility and the lack of a public school system left the Irish without the means to find a solution to the potato famine issue. Hughes argues that if the Irish were to blame because they were ignorant, the British put them in the position to be ignorant. Thus, the root of the problem was with the British government and the classist system they set up with no prospect for land ownership or social mobility for the Irish. Whether or not one accepts that specific argument, it is a fact that most landowners during the era in Ireland were British absentee lords who did not actively involve themselves and worked the actual Irish as tenant farmers who were treated little better than the serfs of Russia. Dagger John also surmises that the famine was handled in a way that weakened Irish resistance to British rule, and while I chalk this up primarily as Irish nationalism at work, one could make the case for this argument, especially based on the political climate of 1848 in Europe. In an era where lower classes all over the continent were rebelling, Britain was spared rebellion. To a cynical person, a famine seems like a convenient way to crush dissenters. Regardless of what you want to use to prove your case that the British were negligent or even malevolent, there is ample evidence that the British government contributed significantly to the horror that was the Great Hunger. The fact that Britain recognized that the famine was occurring and did not attempt to deny it to the outside world separates them from the Soviet and the Chinese governments. After a relatively thorough investigation of both sides, though, the information provided merits some culpability for the British government. The statistics on mortality and the fact that the government's actions directly correlate with the worst year of the famine in 1847 are enough to make the claim that the Irish Potato Famine was at least partially hunger that was engineered by the British government. It is my hope that this investigation helps bring to light information that assists in preventing horrors like government-manufactured famines from happening. Natural famines are trouble enough.